Okay, welcome everyone. I'm standing in for Margaret Hask, the director of the library. My name is Shari Goodfriend, and I'm the publicist for the library. And my friend and colleague Ben Lesh is helping me run things behind the scenes. So thank you, Ben. I also wanted to thank Jane Garmy, who is on the program committee and who came up with the idea for today's event, which I think you all know is called Who Wrote the Bible and Why on Earth Does It Matter? So it will take place in a conversation format, although I know Martine also has a special presentation. And our guests are Martien Halvorson-Taylor and Franny Taliaferro. And I will now take a moment to introduce our two guests. So Franny, as many of you know, is a longtime resident of Cornwall. And for decades, she taught English at the Brearley School in New York City, where she first posed this question of who wrote the Bible to our guest speaker, Martine, in her 12th grade English class. And in addition to her career in education, Franny is a book reviewer whose work has appeared in Harper's, the New York Times, and various other publications. And Franny and her late husband, Lee, and their daughter, Cassandra, came to Cornwall in 1977 as summer renters and have stayed ever since. Now, our next guest, Martien Halvorson-Taylor, shares a house in Cornwall with her sister, but she is coming to us today from Charlottesville, Virginia, where she is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia. After receiving her BA from Yale, where she majored in English, literature, and language, she went on to Harvard, where she then earned a master's in divinity and a PhD in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. She is a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament, as well as the literature, religions, and history of ancient Israel. Her academic writing has focused on the Babylonian exile and the concepts of exile, forced migration, and diaspora. She is currently working on a commentary on the Song of Songs, which is an extended erotic love poem in the Hebrew Bible. And she has an ongoing collaboration with environmental scientists, astronomers, artists, and other scholars in the humanities to think about the relationship between religion, land, and environmental change. She co-hosts a leading podcast on global religion called Sacred and Profane, and is the author of a new Audible course called Writing the Bible. And more information can be found on her website, martienhalvorson-taylor.com/writing the Bible. But you don't have to remember that because I'll put it in the chat. And I will also put links to her website, her Audible course, and podcast as well. So be sure to check the chat and copy and paste that into your browsers. And also, we will be taking questions through the chat because we have so many people joining us. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, we have to keep you all muted, but I'm sure you'll have questions. So please put them into the chat and we will read them at the end, as we'll try to get to as many as we can. So with that, let's get started. And I'm going to turn it over to Franny.
Thank you, Shari. This is a very big week in biblical texts. Today is Palm Sunday, and many of you have heard the story of the Passion if you are Christians going to church on Palm Sunday. You have Easter to look forward to. If you are Jewish, then you have Passover at the end of the week. And that is a heavily text-dependent event. But what we're here to talk about today is how the Bible got put together. Notice how carefully I'm avoiding the word written, which may not be totally appropriate. I think, Martine, we should probably establish right away that we're going to be talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and not the New, mostly. But I wonder if you'd like to say anything about the challenges that may have faced both the compilers of both Old and New Testaments.
Yes, it's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. And thanks to everyone for coming and to the Cornwall Library for hosting. So the story of how the Hebrew Bible was compiled and how the New Testament was compiled are actually quite different. There are similarities. Both for a long time relied on oral traditions. But they were actually both subject to what I would call different writing technologies. So the Hebrew Bible was written, when it eventually was written on scrolls. And there's, which are still used in Jewish synagogues today, sort of a long sheet of papyrus, or sometimes it was animal skin, that was rolled on both ends together, and you rolled it along as you read. And eventually those texts would be transferred onto a codex, which is more like our regular book, the precursor to the modern book. But the New Testament was always on a codex, and the ways that you read and the ways that you compile are different based on what form you're using. And we'll talk a bit more about that. But it's interesting how the technology of writing changed, and with it, the process of composition.
Okay. Well, why don't you jump right in?
Okay.
And start telling us.
All right, I will do that. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation for you all. Okay. So there are a few things that I thought might be of interest to you as a library audience, as lovers of books, as writers yourselves, as we think about who we are as modern readers and writers in relationship to our ancient selves. Things that I wanted to tell you that sort of came to the fore in the writing of this Audible short course, which is called Writing the Bible. And they are, very roughly, that the Bible contains clues to its own formation, but how we read those clues has changed over time. That we limit our understanding of the Hebrew Bible by configuring biblical authors in our own image. They did not read, write, and create just as we do. And we also limit ourselves by thinking about the Hebrew Bible as a modern book, when in fact, as I just alluded to, for most of its history, it was oral, and eventually it was written on scrolls. So the first thing I want to start with is a biblical example to anchor us. And it's a biblical example that contains clues about who wrote the Bible. And very conveniently, they come in the first two chapters of the Old Testament, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So the first book of the Bible begins in chapter 1 with the account of creation, of how God created the world over the course of 7 days. And God is here called by the Hebrew name Elohim. And this is a story that starts in the midst of a dark and watery chaos. When Elohim began to create the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from Elohim swept over the face of the waters. And Elohim, God, speaks creation into being with a series of very precise verbal pronouncements, emphasizing that he is creating, bara is the Hebrew verb, and dividing. He says, let there be light, and there was light, and he separates the light from the darkness. He says, let the waters under the sky be gathered in one place, and let the dry land appear. He transforms the dark and watery chaos steadily, rhythmically, methodically, so that the waters are divided and dry land emerges. This is creation by separating and organizing so that everything is in its place. Fish in the air, birds in the air, fish in the water, birds in the air, plants and trees on land. And God is something like a master organizer here, a master, maybe like the Marie Kondo of the primordial world, assessing what is good, what sparks joy, putting things in place and moving on. And on the sixth day, we learn that God created humankind. This is a depiction of the creation of humankind in Genesis 1 at the National Cathedral. So Elohim created humankind in his image. In the image of Elohim, he created them male and female. He created them. And you can see human beings, male and female, emerging from watery chaos. But in chapter 2, verse 4, we seem to begin all over again with another story of creation that we also know well. In it, God is called by a different name, by the Hebrew consonants Yod He Vav He, which are sometimes pronounced Yahweh, and which most English translations translate as the Lord. When God begins to create, he creates things that had already been created. So it begins in that day that Yahweh made the heaven and the earth, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for Yahweh had not caused it to rain upon the earth. So it's odd because he had, in fact, in the previous chapter, created plants of the field and herbs of the field. And he had, in fact, created all humankind. And now it says, then Yahweh formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. So even as this creation story seems to duplicate what happened before, there are differences. Among them, while both stories begin at the same point, they begin from a different baseline, right? In Genesis 2, God is creating from arid land. It is from the dust of the earth that the first being is created. And it is by watering the land that God is able to plant a garden known as the Garden of Eden. In the first creation story, it works in reverse. The dry, habitable land only emerges when it is rescued from the waters. And of course, both chapters use different names for God and different vocabulary. In the first creation story, God creates and separates. And in the second, a bunch of verbs are used for the creative act that are also used of humans making things, of craftsmen and women. Verbs like to make and to form. So these two accounts are sometimes called a doublet. And there are doublets throughout the Hebrew Bible, well beyond Genesis 1 and 2. There are two different numbers of animals that Noah took onto the ark. Moses hauls himself up and down the mountain to receive the commandments multiple times, somewhat like he's on a Stairmaster. And laws that seem to regulate the same cases have different prescriptions. Now, these doublets became significant in a new way in the modern period when scholars in the European Enlightenment developed critical tools for discerning when and how, for example, Greek literature was composed. And they began to wonder if they could apply these tools to the Bible. And specifically, they wondered if these doublets might indicate that there are two competing stories, each written by a different author at a different time. In other words, could these doublets, like the two creation stories, be a source for clues about how the Bible was written? A late 19th century German biblical scholar, Julius Wellhausen, building on centuries of earlier scholarship, put forth the documentary hypothesis, in which he proposed that doublets like those we find in Genesis indicate that it was made up of sources. Two creation stories reflect two different and originally independent sources that were only later edited together. And in this, he and other scholars like him were implicitly pushing back against the traditional notion that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and against the modern supposition that the Bible was written all at once, because books are written usually within a discrete time period. These scholars viewed the Bible as composite, as layered, as containing multiple sources. And they came to see the writing of the Bible as a complex process that would have taken place over the course of centuries, and that were sometimes written long after the events that they purported to describe. And in this, they were, in fact, correct. The two different creation stories were drawn from two different documents written by two different authors at two different times, and actually two different locations, which explains that differing baseline for creation. Genesis 1 was written by Jewish exiles in Babylon in the 6th century before the Common Era, where the spring rains flood everything and threaten to destroy everyone, and during which people long for the waters to recede. They think it's never going to happen, and they pray to their gods to tame the waters. This is why creation begins in a watery chaos, with God ordering the waters and creating dry lands. Genesis 2, by contrast, was written by Jews in the land of Israel. That is why, for example, creation begins when God irrigates dry earth. That's the way things grow in the landscape of Judah. So in this way of reading the stories that Wellhausen and others put forth, Genesis 1 doesn't tell us so much about the creation of the world as it tells us what a 6th century community of Jews who have experienced the Babylonian exile thought about the creation of the world. And it allows us to see how Genesis is actually contending with the creation stories of the Babylonian oppressors. It, for example, holds up the creation of the human being as something very special. Only the human being is created in the image of God, which is implicitly challenging the Babylonian creation myth, in which human beings are created to do the drudge work of the gods. They're not in the image of the gods. They are slaves and servants of the gods. But for all the insight that this kind of source criticism provided, it also had its limitations. And one of these was that Wellhausen actually puts forth an image of biblical authors and editors that look very much like a German biblical scholar of the 19th century. He had modern ideas about books, about authorship, and about writing that unduly influenced his theory. For one, the sources were complete written sources that were cut and pasted by an editor or a redactor, much as a modern editor might edit a book. And he also judged this ancient redactor to be somewhat mechanical, and even describes him as somewhat clumsy and sort of literarily inept. Scholars began to, in the wake of Wellhausen, describe the jagged edges of the biblical text, the rough seams, the gaps, the inconsistencies that surely any modern intelligent reader could perceive. But there is, in fact, a certain artistry in placing these one after another, Genesis 1 and 2. And we would do better to think about what the ancient editors had in mind than judging them by our standard. Perhaps the writers of the Bible intentionally left signs of their compositional history there, not because they didn't notice, but because the ancient reader and we, the modern reader, are to engage with them, to do some work on them. Perhaps they aren't attempting to write a narrative in which events come in sequence. That's how ancients tend to tell stories. They tell stories in circles, not in linear narratives, particularly ancient stories. Perhaps they were presenting two aspects of creation and of God simultaneously. Genesis 1 is about the creation of the cosmos. Genesis 2 is beloved for its stories about the origins of human relationships and the pleasures and the pains of human love. Ancient storytelling doesn't always run along the modern notion of a beginning, a middle, and an end. It can circle around and around, telling twice in order to represent sort of the multi-dimension of an event simultaneously. And in emphasizing these sources as written, as somehow complete, Wellhausen hadn't reckoned with how long these materials remained oral. The creators of the Bible were as much, if not more, talkers. They were storytellers, they were singers, they were memorizers more than writers. They began in a largely pre-literate culture, and many of their stories, the stories of the creation of the world, the stories of Exodus, the stories of Moses and the liberation, they originated and passed on orally for generations. They were modified by communities and not as much by single individual authors. And more to the point, it's from these communities that the stories, the laws, the histories, the songs of Israel derive their meaning and their power. They weren't bounded, in other words, like a modern book or a modern source might be. They were more fluid and they were more malleable, running off the page and back onto it. There was no rigidity to fight in combining traditions. Eventually, traditions would be written on scrolls starting around the 7th or maybe even the 6th century before the Common Era, when we have archaeological evidence that literacy in Judah was on the rise. They were handwritten by scrolls who were a professional class charged with all sorts of palace and temple responsibilities and administration, but also as keepers of their historical, legal, and mythic traditions. And it's likely that they knew much of their texts by heart. So as these oral traditions were written down, the process was dynamic and communal. Scribes wrote materials that they had memorized, they wrote things down in order to read them aloud again, and they memorized materials that were written down by other scribes. The relationship between writing, reading, and memorizing remained complex and dynamic, and the traditions remained alive orally, never fully static on the page. And they were not mechanical. They made creative choices in assembling pieces of the tradition and in making those traditions accessible or understandable to subsequent generations. They were, in that sense, as much translators and guides as they were writers. They were supplementing, rearranging, glossing. Now, while it was an intensely creative process, it wasn't like being a modern author. For one, they would never have thought of themselves that way. They didn't think of themselves as making something new, and they didn't have the sense of ownership, personal ownership over a text that a modern author sometimes claims. They thought of themselves as conduits of the past. And this is probably how the tradition that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, developed. Moses, who had received the commandments that are in the book of Deuteronomy, eventually became regarded as the author of all of Deuteronomy, and then gradually the rest of the 5 first books, the Torah or the Pentateuch as well. This wasn't a fib and it wasn't forgery. It was rather a sign of respect, a recognition that the narrative traditions and the laws were only important if they continued in the tradition of Moses. Any insight that an ancient scribe had or might have had in their minds was actually indebted to Moses, in whose path they walked. While they received and curated these traditions of long standing, we can detect their artistry and hear their voices in how they reworked them. Shakespeare wasn't any less of a genius because he worked off of received traditions about various kings that he features in his plays. We generally recognize that, in fact, his genius is in full display because of how he reworked them. These are all creative acts: editing, assembling, reframing. And they are creative because they're not simply preserving, keeping traditions, but they're trying to make them meaningful and relevant to the present circumstance of the audience. And in this, you would have to say that the scribes were successful because the results are, in my view, spectacular. So I want to end by suggesting a personal analogy for how biblical literature was formed. And that is, we all have stories in our minds and in our hearts that we bear with us over time, that have been passed on by our families from generation to generation. I often think that I am who I am, or at least have the sense of myself that I do, because of the stories that my grandparents told me about their families, about our family, which gave me a sense of origins, right? The stories that my grandmother told me in the front of her woody station wagon, or the stories that my grandfather told me as we walked the streets of his hometown. They gave me memories that I would claim as my own, but from a time from before I was born, stories about ancestors, about parents and grandparents that had died long before. And in a way, they connected me to an eternal past. Each of us makes decisions in our own life about which stories we value or even remember, and which we want to pass on to our children. And this is not unlike what the scribes were doing and what communities who were largely oral were doing as they passed on their stories. There may be stories that are too boring, or maybe even painful, or even shameful, that we don't tell. In this way, the Bible is a collection of family stories that have been passed down from one generation to the next. In a sense, the stories that ancient Israel ended up taking and telling and passing on, especially when they were exiled into a new land, were the stories that they judged to be relevant and life-giving, and they shaped them to be so. So finally, I want to end with, why does it matter? Why does all this matter? Why are we concerned with who wrote the Bible? So I come back to something that Franny, or Mrs. T, as we called her back at the Brearley School, told us in that first English class where I read the Hebrew Bible. She said at the end of the class, after we had studied the many sources of the Hebrew Bible and the many voices within the book, that we could never again say, the Bible says. And what she meant by that is that the Bible is not univocal. it's not also unequivocal, but we can talk to save that for another moment. That's also a political statement in retrospect. But I think thinking about who wrote the Bible reminds us that it contains so many voices, a kaleidoscope of ideas about who God is, what the good life is, what it means to be human, how to flourish. There are well-worn and tried and true ideas, a diversity of them that have been passed by multiple hands through the generation. And there's a trove of wisdom and insight to be found in paying close attention to what these ancients said, thought, felt, and learned along the way. And recognizing their voices, their many voices, is a key way to do that. I do have one more slide that I want to show you, which is to emphasize the point about how technology of writing and reading has changed. So I think you can see my cursor, but on the left side, we have the various scrolls. So this is an actual scroll fragment on the lower left corner from the Dead Sea. Actually, now that I look at it, it's Genesis 1, no less. And this is how it would have looked in its scroll formation. And you can see how you would have to roll it along, that it was long, and you'd have to roll it along. You couldn't just open it and have it fall to the page that you wanted. You'd have to roll it in order to get it to the point of the text that you wanted to get it to. That's quite different from up here is the Greek Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, and also the Hebrew Old Testament on the upper right. That's actually a picture from my office. I can flip to whatever page I want, and I can sort of go in and sort of, in a way, I can take the text atomically. I can sort of zero in on a text very easily. One thing to consider is how our habits of reading and writing about the Bible will change now that we are in the lower right-hand corner, more and more reading our Bibles online. And will that change how we think about who wrote the Bible?
Thank you so much for that gallop through the history of the making of the Bible. As you were talking about family stories, I suddenly thought of closet cleaning and turning things up. And I thought of the Dead Sea Scrolls as maybe a version of finding something in a closet that you had stashed away and then forgotten about. How much do the Dead Sea Scrolls contribute to scholarship about the Hebrew Bible?
A great deal, but not in the ways that we thought it would. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first came to light in the 1940s, people imagined that they might find the sources for the Bible, sort of like the crib notes. There was no little anxiety that they might discover that Jesus was not the original thinker that he was. So there was this anxiety that they had uncovered sources. What they found, however, was quite different. What they found were some books look like the books that we have in the Bible. Others look quite different. So the version of Jeremiah at Qumran has been shuffled. It's in a different order. The Song of Songs, which I'm working on now, is incomplete, right? It looks like somebody either took the juicy bits out, or maybe it hadn't developed into its full extent. but there are a number of things like that. A fascinating fact is that to date, we have not yet discovered a fragment of the Book of Esther. For some reason, the community at Qumran may not have liked the Book of Esther. It's an argument from absence. Maybe, that scroll was lost to the, sands of time. Who knows? But what it reminded us was these were texts written over a period of centuries, from about the 3rd century through about the 3rd century before the Common Era until about the 1st century of the Common Era. And it reminded us, first and foremost, how fluid the canonical process was, beyond our wildest imaginings, that the Bible was not fixed, that there were different communities that had different versions, and sometimes they had different versions side by side, that there are 2 existing scrolls of the Song of Songs, and they don't preserve all the same things, and one will have one thing and one will have another thing. And there wasn't this notion of bounded fixed texts that we continue to imagine was so, because we have a bounded fixed text. Finally, due to mass printing, most of us on our bookshelf have a copy of the Bible. So it reminded us how fluid the process is. I could say 100 more things about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, I've now listened to your excellent audio presentation, writing the Bible, and it gave me so many things to worry about. One of which,
Tell me, let me assuage your anxieties, Franny.
one of them was the idea of authorship itself. And you pointed out that there's no word in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, for author. So there's authorship, and then there's technology. And to me, it was mind-blowing to think of the introduction of writing as really the introduction of technology in just about the same way that we have all had to learn to get along with a computer. People had to grasp the idea that writing was good for something. And that seems to be related to the problem of sacredness. And when a human hand is writing something, does that adulterate the sacredness of the written thing? So that's a whole jumble of worries.
But a wonderful one. So yes, it does look like early on, when writing is on the rise, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, who is cranky about many things, actually gets a little snarky about writing. He takes a jab at something that is claimed to be the word of God. He views it as unreliable. And it's true that prophetic speech was speech, right? It was even though we preserve it now in written form, it's very much presented as speech. The word of God really was meant to be oral. This newfangled thing about writing and more people writing, what is the world coming to? That's not how we do it. There's a similar anxiety about the advent of the internet, right? What is it going to do to our patterns of writing and reading? And I'm sure many of us know that writing on a computer is very different from writing on paper. And that move even before that from oral memorization and recitation to writing provokes a similar anxiety and how are we going to do this, and also it it computes differently. How you write something is different from how you speak it.
Yes. But what about the problem of sacredness? And how do texts become scripture?
Yes. So this is something else that Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, is also helpful with. It looked like the notion of a text being sacred is also somewhat late. That there was the notion that there were a lot of books out there, and Qumran actually preserves a lot of books and texts that we don't think of as the Bible. And they seem to have had similar status with books that we now think of as having sacred authority. It wasn't a seamless process. It wasn't like in a certain year it was decided these books are in and these books are out. We also have the problem that the Jewish canon of the Old Testament does not even look like the Protestant canon of the Old Testament, does not even look like the Catholic version. So in a way, you could say those debates continue, right? It's not solved. And the rabbis are debating well into the Common Era about whether or not books like Esther and Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, whether or not they defile the hands, which is a rabbinic idiom for are sacred. So there wasn't a sort of magic transformation. It was certain texts gathering authority. My suspicion is that it was the books of Moses that gathered authority first. We have the scribe Ezra describing how he read that aloud and how meaningful it was. It's in written form. It is being read aloud. He doesn't describe it as sacred, but he does at certain points allude to it as the word of God.
Okay. Well, another pearl that you let drop was just a tiny little statement about the possibility that maybe the Song of Songs could have been one of the only books that could have had a female author. And that made me think also about Harold Bloom's book, The Book of Jay, which I think probably many people here today have read, which argues that a great deal of the Samuel David story was written by a aristocratic woman at court. I wonder if you would comment on the possibility of anything female.
The possibility of it. So I mean, I think in general, we undersell women in the ancient world. They weren't all kept at home. And we certainly have a number of female figures, particularly in the book of Genesis, who seem to posit different models for leadership. You know, I would take a Rebecca over an Isaac anytime. You know, so I think in general, we should not imagine that this was sort of a puritanical society in which women were, you know, really kept at home. And now I know that every historian of Puritan America is probably going to put something in the chat to say I've got that wrong, but I'm going to hold to it. We have this image of a certain kind of propriety in the ancient world that I think was probably not there. That said, I don't know how we would conclusively prove that a text was written by a man or by a woman. Do we say because it's interested in male things or female things that it was written by a man or by a woman? Do we count the number of certain kinds of nouns and verbs? Like I literally don't know the method. Now, that said, the Song of Songs begins in the voice of a woman and it ends in the voice of a woman, and she dominates. It's really her book. It is not impossible that a male songwriter or a male poet wrote in her voice. And there is a biblical scholar out there that claims that she is a male fantasy of what a woman would sound like. That's not how I would read her. I can't prove that it was written by a woman, but boy, does she sound a lot like Sappho. You know, that might be one way of getting at it.
Well, I think Harold Bloom likes to make mischief, and
yes, yeah, and the Bloom book is provocative. Again, I would say that some of the things that he regards as, you know, the sensitivity of the characters, the attention to, you know, interpersonal dynamics. I don't know that those necessarily always have to be the purview of women. So it's not that I want to say it wasn't written by a woman. It's just I don't know how we can decisively land on that issue.
in your introduction to your audible.com, you say something about your early attraction to the strange and wonderful stories of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering stories you have in mind as strange and wonderful.
Well, Jacob wrestling with an angel, as we've discussed before. I still can't get over the Joseph story. I love that story. And every time I read it, I hear something new. I love his ambivalence. I think it's so finely drawn. The fact that he seems to be, on the one hand, incredibly ambitious, and he, you know, rises through the ranks, but he also pays a heavy price throughout. And then he does things like name his children, you know, I've forgotten all of my misfortunes in my father's house, which means that every time he says his firstborn son's name, he remembers his misfortunes and his father's house. I love the ambiguity of that weird meeting between Joseph and his brothers, where they don't recognize him and he hasn't seen them in years.
Yes.
And he keeps having to excuse himself to go into the other room and cry. And then he comes back and he speaks very sternly to them and scares them and puts them through the paces. What's that about? Every time I read it, I have a different take on it. And I think that's sort of the point, right? I think you're meant to wonder along this stuff. The ambiguity, the ambivalence, that's really a very productive way of telling a story. And it can hold you in different ways at different moments of your life. It means one thing at a certain age and it means another thing at another age. I'm struck by this a lot with my students, seeing sort of their take on what are the main dynamics of a story, as 18, 19, and 20-year-olds are very different from the dynamics that I perceive as someone who's older, and who has children, versus as primarily, my students are still being children. So
Thank you. That's enough to send anybody straight to Genesis to take a look at the Joseph story. Shari, I think you've been collecting questions, if there are any. Do you want to hand any over to us?
Yes, actually, thank you. We do have a lot of questions. Thanks to both of you so much for sparking everyone's curiosity on so many issues. So I have a list here. I'm just going to start with the first one that came in, which is, is it true that also regarding the New Testament, it's written and reflecting many voices as well?
Yes. I mean, for one, they need 4 gospels to tell the story of Jesus's life. And which is interesting because the modern mind harmonizes those all the time. We wouldn't have Christmas pageants if we only had the Gospel of John. There's no infancy story in the Gospel of John. So yes, there are analogies. And there's also anxiety about who is writing this stuff. There's the pseudo-Pauline letter, meaning not written by Paul, in which he says, I wrote this with my very own hand, right? Somebody is anxious about what it means to present this as in the mold of Paul. So there are definite analogies, but that's a whole nother world.
Someone would like to know, where do the Q documents come into play?
That's New Testament.
Okay.
And that's very interesting. I will say that it is quite it's like, so the Q document is when scholars began to lay the synoptic gospels, that's everything but John, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, next to each other, and began to perceive that maybe sometimes they were working off of a similar source. Not that sometimes they borrow from each other, but that this is working off of a similar source. And it's from the German Quelle, meaning source, and it's never been found. I would say the same about our friend Wellhausen's sources, these complete sources that he claimed existed. They also have never been found. It's a little bit of detective work, and there is a logic to it, and a lot has been revealed, but it is all hypothesis, as he called it, speculation.
Okay, I'm just going to jump around with a couple of the questions to make sure that they're really specific to this talk. So I apologize to anyone whose question I don't get to, but we're trying to do as many as we can in a sort of lightning round here. So one person would like to know about the why does it matter part of your talk. Can you give us a few more examples, historical examples of arguments over who wrote the Bible and the stakes for the participants in those arguments or disputes? That is to say, why does it matter to those on different sides of the argument about who wrote the Bible? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's an excellent question. And I'm going to give a go at it, but please come back to me if you want other examples. People were interested initially in who wrote the Bible, and it was a modern question. The whole construct of the question is modern, but even asking it was very modern, because there was the presumption that stuff that was old was real, was truer, was more original. So Wellhausen played favorites with his sources. He liked his oldest source best, which was the J source that Harold Bloom wrote about, which is the story of Adam and Eve and the planting of the Garden of Eden. He really didn't like the P source, and this was where his writing was the most anti-Semitic. He regarded the P or the priestly source, which we find in Genesis 1, which is interested in ritual matters like keeping the Sabbath. He equated it with Judaism of a sort that he did not care for. There's been some interesting work done in which a compelling argument has actually been made that P is actually older than J. There's a lot of back and forth about it. But that, I think, is interesting for why does it matter? That spins a whole new world. Now we have this story of Adam and Eve as a comment on Genesis 1, and suddenly it means something different. I'm going to leave it just with that because I could go on and on, but I won't. But I want to give you another example. Another example is the book of Isaiah, which again, the first 39 chapters are by in the mouth of a prophet named Isaiah of Jerusalem, who lived during a political crisis in the 8th century before the Common Era. And then starting in chapter 40, we have a very different circumstance. It seems to be a speaker who lives outside the land, who's in the Babylonian exile, who lives in the last decades of the 6th century before the Common Era. He's talking about something very different. And that really bothered people because all of a sudden, the new stuff was the stuff that they should have been sloughing off because it was later accretions, later glosses, not original, not really Isaiah, was actually the stuff they loved. It was those wonderful verses, comfort ye, my people. It was all of the Christians were upset because it was all of the chapters that predicted the birth of Jesus, and now they have had to be sort of pushed aside. So all of this is to say, this is a very wordy answer to a wonderful question. It changes how you read things. It changes what they mean to you. For some people, the oldest stuff will be better. For others, the later editions challenge us to assimilate older ideas to newer circumstances.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to just put one last question forth from our audience. Thank you so much, everyone who's written in. I'm going to forward these to Martine afterwards, so in case you want to have some communication with people who've asked these questions.
Absolutely. Anybody
okay.
can email me. I'm happy to talk more.
And please, everyone, check the beginning of the chat for the links that I posted as well to the Audible course and also her podcast. But for now, this is one last question from also a previous student of Ms. T, I should say, Mrs. T, Ms. Tolliver, from Chrissia Burnham. She said, would you say that there is significance that Elohim is plural in Genesis 1? I learned in divinity school that this suggested that God had a possible female consort, hence in our image. And I have always loved this and would appreciate your thoughts.
I think that's a wonderful reading. I do think we know from graffiti, Hebrew graffiti, that many people did think that God had a consort, had a female partner. I'm not sure it's in that particular word, but there are other indications that for a long time in Israelite religion, there was the belief that God had a wife, had a partner, had a consort.
So I hate to say this, but I think we need to leave it there. But I am so appreciative of everyone who joined us today, and so grateful to both of you for your time and your incredible expertise and sharing that with all of us. It's been a real pleasure, and I think it's left us, at least me, with my head spinning and many thoughts and questions. So folks, feel free to, as I said, to check out those links, and also thank you for joining us, and please come to our future events as well. Thanks again, Franny and Martine. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Franny.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Martine.
Bye, everyone.